Imagine sitting in a performance review with a middle manager you absolutely despise, feeling your stomach do slow, sickening flips while he talks down to you about your quarterly metrics. You make $135,000 a year. You max out your 401k every single cycle. You aggressively funnel money into a diversified portfolio of index funds. And on paper, your net worth looks like a massive success story. But as you sit in that sterile glass conference room, taking the abuse, you suddenly realize with a cold wave of panic that you cannot stand up, tell him exactly what you think of him, and walk out that door. You can't leave. Because despite being technically wealthy, you only have about 3 weeks of actual liquid cash sitting in your checking account. You have optimized yourself into a corner, becoming a highly paid hostage to a job that is destroying your mental health. And the financial advice you have been religiously following your entire adult life is exactly what locked the door from the outside. What almost nobody realizes is that we have been sold a completely engineered narrative about what money is actually supposed to do for us. For the last 20 years, the entire financial industry, the internet gurus, the podcasters, and the best-selling authors have been screaming the exact same terrifying message into our ears. Cash is trash. They tell you that inflation is an invisible thief stealing your future, that every dollar sitting in a bank account is dying, and that if you aren't investing every spare cent into the market, you are actively choosing to be poor. On the surface, this makes sense. But in reality, this is one of the most toxic, paralyzing wealth traps ever designed. It is a philosophy that optimizes for numbers on a spreadsheet while completely destroying your actual power in the real world. You are told to fear the 3% you lose to inflation, but you are deliberately kept blind to the suffocating psychological cost of having zero liquidity when your life inevitably goes off the rails. Let me introduce you to Sarah. Sarah is 34, pulling in that exact $135,000 salary in corporate tech sales. She is brilliant, disciplined, and terrified of falling behind. She read all the right books and listened to all the right podcasts. Every time she gets paid, her money is instantly routed into restricted retirement accounts, aggressive brokerage accounts, and illiquid real estate syndications. She operates with surgical precision, leaving exactly enough cash in her checking account to cover her mortgage, her utilities, and her groceries for the month. When she logs into her financial dashboard, she sees a net worth of over $400,000. She feels a brief, fleeting hit of dopamine, convincing herself she is winning the game. But here's where it gets interesting, because Sarah's brain knows something her spreadsheet doesn't. Her brain knows that her entire existence relies on that direct deposit hitting every second Friday. She knows that if her company restructuring rumors are true, or if her toxic boss finally pushes her over the edge, her $400,000 in assets are completely useless to her on a Tuesday afternoon. If she loses her income, she can't buy groceries with a fraction of an S&P 500 index fund. She would be forced to break into her retirement accounts, swallow massive early withdrawal penalties, and pay crippling taxes just to keep her lights on. The realization sits in the back of her mind like a low-grade fever. She is investment rich, but she is functionally, practically broke. And this is the part that should worry you, because Sarah didn't make a mistake. She followed the rules flawlessly, and the reward for her discipline is a life where she is terrified to take a single risk, terrified to speak up in meetings, and terrified to demand what she is actually worth. And this is where most people get it wrong. They believe that building a massive portfolio is the ultimate defense against a chaotic world. They think that as their investments grow, their anxiety will naturally shrink. But when every dollar you own is locked behind market fluctuations, tax penalties, and settlement periods, you haven't built a fortress. You have built a beautiful, velvet-lined prison. You have traded your immediate agency for the promise of a comfortable retirement 30 years from now, completely ignoring the fact that you have to survive the psychological warfare of the next 3 decades to get there. But that's not even the real problem with being fully invested. The real problem is a concept the financial industry desperately hopes you never understand. And it has to do with how opportunity actually functions in the real economy. They love to talk to you about the opportunity cost of holding cash. They will show you endless charts, proving how much money you left on the table by not having that cash in the market over a 10-year bull run. But what they conveniently hide from you is that opportunity cost works in both directions. There is a massive, life-altering cost to not having cash when the world catches on fire. Imagine the economy takes a sudden, violent hit. The market drops 30% in a matter of weeks. Companies freeze hiring, credit markets dry up, and fear saturates the news cycle. If you are operating like Sarah, your portfolio just took a catastrophic blow. You are watching hundreds of thousands of dollars evaporate from your screen. You are paralyzed. You can't buy the dip because you have no fresh capital. You can't take advantage of the panic because you are part of the panic. You are just holding on for dear life, praying you don't get laid off when your investments are at absolute rock bottom. Now look at a guy like James. James works in the exact same office as Sarah, makes the exact same salary, but he operates under a completely different psychological framework. Years ago, James realized that the financial industry only makes money when your money is invested with them. They don't collect management fees on your checking account. So James decided to do something that makes financial advisors physically cringe. Alongside his steady investments, he began aggressively stockpiling cash. Not a tiny 3-month emergency fund, but a massive, undeniably heavy pile of liquid cash. He built up $150,000 sitting right there in a boring, accessible savings account. His friends laughed at him. They sent him inflation calculators. They told him his money was rotting. And James just smiled and let them talk. Because James understood that his cash was not an investment meant to generate a yield. His cash was a loaded weapon, and he was just waiting for a target. When that market crash happens, and the world goes into a blind panic, James doesn't feel a single drop of cortisol. While everyone else is terrified of losing their jobs, James is calmly scrolling through commercial real estate listings. He finds a desperate landlord who over-leveraged himself and needs to liquidate a duplex immediately to avoid bankruptcy. The property is worth $400,000, but the guy is begging for $250,000 just to get out alive. Because James has the cash sitting there, cleared and ready to wire, he bypasses the frozen banks. He bypasses the panic. He buys the asset at a massive, once-in-a-decade discount. 5 years later, when the market recovers, that one transaction will have generated more wealth for James than a lifetime of perfectly optimized, dollar-cost averaged index fund contributions. And this is where everything starts to break for the people who refuse to hold cash. They calculate the $3,000 they lose to inflation every year, but they never calculate the $200,000 they lose by being unable to act when an asymmetrical opportunity drops into their lap. They optimize for the everyday baseline, and in doing so, they completely disqualify themselves from the extraordinary moments that actually create generational wealth. The truth that nobody wants to admit is that the greatest wealth transfers in history don't happen when things are calm. They happen when things break. And you can only participate in the transfer if you have the liquidity to step into the wreckage. But we have to look deeper than just market crashes, because the true power of holding substantial cash reserves alters the fundamental trajectory of your everyday life. It changes your biology. It changes how you breathe, how you speak, and how you are perceived by the market. This is the concept of walk-away power, and it is the most intoxicating, dangerous superpower a human being can possess in a modern economy. When you have 2 years of living expenses sitting in a bank account, you undergo a profound psychological mutation. You stop operating from a place of fear. When James walks into his performance review with that same toxic boss that Sarah has, the dynamic is entirely different. James doesn't need the next paycheck to survive. He doesn't need the year-end bonus to cover his mortgage, because his survival is not tied to the whim of the man sitting across the table. James doesn't give off the subtle, desperate scent of a hostage. He speaks calmly. He pushes back on unreasonable demands. He negotiates his salary not by begging for a raise, but by stating his value with the cold, hard detachment of someone who is perfectly willing to pack up his desk and leave at 5 p.m. if he doesn't get what he wants. And here is the beautiful, twisted irony of the corporate world. When you genuinely do not need them, they suddenly want you more. Bosses, clients, and business partners can smell financial independence. It is an aura. When you are not desperate, people perceive you as highly valuable. James gets the promotion. He gets the massive raise, and he gets the respect, specifically because he had the financial leverage to not care. Sarah, who is desperately trying to be the perfect employee because she needs the cash flow, is passed over and taken for granted. Her lack of liquidity forces her into submission, which permanently stunts her earning potential. What almost nobody realizes is that your career trajectory is not dictated by your talent. It is dictated by your risk tolerance. If you have no cash, your risk tolerance is zero. You cannot quit the terrible job to start your own agency. You cannot take a 6-month sabbatical to learn a high-income skill like artificial intelligence. You cannot move across the country for a high-upside startup role because you can't afford the transition period. You are geographically, professionally, and creatively frozen. You spend the best years of your life playing defense, trying to protect your fragile cash flow, while the people with cash reserves are playing offense, taking massive swings that exponentially increase their income. And Sarah didn't realize this until she was 42 years old, staring at a screen, feeling a heavy, dark wave of future regret wash over her. She looked at her portfolio, which had grown to over $1 million. She was officially a millionaire. But her body was exhausted. She had spent the last decade enduring chronic stress, missing family events, and swallowing her pride, all to keep feeding a portfolio that she couldn't even touch for another 17 years without triggering IRS penalties. She realized, with a sickening drop in her stomach, that she had traded the prime of her actual life for the security of her future life. She had built a massive financial engine, but she forgot to build a life she actually wanted to live. She realized that numbers on a screen do not equal freedom if you do not have the liquidity to buy your way out of a bad day. This is the psychological trap of modern finance. We are taught to delay gratification indefinitely. We are taught that suffering today is the noble price we must pay for compound interest tomorrow. But what is the point of compounding your money if you are simultaneously compounding your misery? If you are sitting there right now, realizing that you have built a life exactly like Sarah's, you are probably feeling a defensive wall going up in your mind. You are looking at the inflation rates, looking at the stock market tearing to new all-time highs, and your loss aversion is screaming at you. You are terrified that if you pull back on your investments and start hoarding cash, you are going to miss out. You are terrified of making a mathematically suboptimal decision. You have to fight that instinct. You have to realize that the math of wealth and the math of human happiness are two entirely different equations, and optimizing for one almost always destroys the other. To escape this, you have to fundamentally rebrand what cash means in your mind. You have to stop looking at it as an emergency fund. An emergency fund is a defensive concept. It implies you are just waiting for a disaster, waiting for your car transmission to blow or your roof to leak. It is a victim's mindset. You need to start viewing your cash as a strike fund. A strike fund is offensive. It is aggressive capital. It is money that you are deliberately holding back from the market so that you can strike when the market bleeds, or strike when a massive career opportunity presents itself. When you lose 3% a year to inflation on a $100,000 strike fund, you are not losing $3,000. You are paying a $3,000 premium for the ultimate insurance policy on your mental health. You are paying $3,000 a year to never have to tolerate disrespect from an employer. You are paying $3,000 a year for the privilege of sleeping soundly through a global recession while your fully invested neighbors are having panic attacks at 3 a.m. When you reframe the math that way, holding cash isn't a mistake. It is the cheapest luxury you will ever buy. But here is where the application of this strategy separates the people who actually get free from the people who just dream about it. Building a massive strike fund requires a level of behavioral discipline that most people simply do not possess, because cash is visible, and it is incredibly tempting. When Sarah tries to build a cash reserve, she sees $50,000 sitting in her checking account, and suddenly, her kitchen looks outdated. Suddenly, her car feels a little too old. The money burns a hole in her psychological pocket, because she hasn't decoupled her ego from her balance sheet. She views cash as spending power rather than viewing it as stored potential energy. James, on the other hand, treats his strike fund as if it belongs to someone else. He doesn't look at it as money he can use to upgrade his lifestyle. He looks at it as a completely separate entity, a silent business partner that requires capital to function. He keeps it in a separate bank, completely disconnected from his primary checking account. He doesn't carry a debit card for it. He creates intentional friction between his sudden impulses and his strategic reserves. And this is the part that should really make you stop and evaluate your entire financial architecture. If an incredible, life-changing opportunity knocked on your door tomorrow, a chance to buy a business, a chance to invest in a friend's wildly successful startup, a chance to take a year off and write the book you've been talking about for a decade, could you answer the door? Or would you have to look through the peephole and quietly walk away because all your wealth is trapped behind the glass of your brokerage account? The financial industry wants you fully invested because they want your capital trapped in their system, generating fees, driving up asset prices, and providing liquidity for the institutional players. They do not want you holding cash because a population with massive cash reserves is a population that cannot be controlled. A population with cash can negotiate. They can walk away. They can refuse bad terms. By convincing you that cash is trash, they have effectively stripped you of your leverage. It is time to take your leverage back. You do not have to sell your entire portfolio tomorrow, but you have to stop funneling every last drop of your liquidity into the market out of a blind fear of inflation. You have to start redirecting your cash flow into a fortress of liquidity. You have to endure the discomfort of watching the stock market rally while your cash sits idle, knowing that the market always breathes out just as violently as it breathes in. Because one day, the music is going to stop. The bubble is going to pop. The layoffs are going to hit your sector, and the sheer panic is going to flood the streets. The people who optimized for the spreadsheet are going to be trapped, watching their net worth evaporate, desperately clinging to jobs they hate just to survive the winter. But you won't be trapped. You will look at your strike fund, you will feel your resting heart rate stay completely flat, and you will step out into the chaos, ready to buy your freedom at a massive discount. The choice is yours. Are you going to keep optimizing for the spreadsheet, or are you finally ready to optimize for your own power?